In the winter of 270 AD, according to multiple ancient chronicles, Emperor Claudius the Second lay dying in his military headquarters at Sirmium. The same plague that had killed his enemies now consumed the victor himself. 2 years earlier, this man had commanded perhaps 50,000 Romans against a Gothic coalition that ancient sources numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He won the most decisive Roman victory in half a century. And the plague that helped him win killed him anyway. Think about those numbers. Contemporary sources claim 50,000 Goths died in a single engagement. Thousands more starved in a frozen siege. The Gothic threat that had terrorized the empire for 2 decades. Broken in months, yet the emperor who saved Rome never lived to see the empire reunified. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the Battle of Naissus in 268 AD became the turning point that prevented Rome's complete collapse during its darkest century. I'm about to reveal 3 documented tactical decisions that changed the course of Western civilization. First, the feigned retreat. A maneuver so risky that one mistake would have meant complete annihilation. Yet ancient sources confirm the Romans executed it perfectly. Second, why a cavalry commander named Aurelian became the true hero of this battle, and how that single day of combat launched him toward the purple. Third, the wagon fortress that should have been impregnable, and the siege warfare innovation that finally broke it. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did an empire fractured into 3 separate states, ravaged by plague, economically collapsed, find the strength for one decisive counterpunch? What made these particular Romans different from the thousands who had already fallen? Why do modern military historians still study the cavalry tactics employed here? And how did victory's aftermath prove more deadly than the battle itself? To understand how Rome clawed back from the abyss, we need to step back to 235 AD, when the empire began tearing itself apart. The year 235 saw the assassination of Severus Alexander, and with him died the last pretense of Roman stability. What followed became known to history as the crisis of the 3rd century. 5 decades when the Roman world seemed determined to destroy itself. Picture the Roman Empire in 260 AD. Not one empire, but 3. The central state centered on Italy and the Balkans, clung to legitimacy under a succession of short-lived emperors. In the west, a usurper named Postumus had established what historians call the Gallic Empire, controlling Gaul, Britannia, and initially Hispania. This wasn't a barbarian kingdom. It was a parallel Roman administration, complete with its own senate, consuls, and praetorian guard. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia and her son Vaballathus had begun asserting autonomy, eventually seizing Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. The mathematics of imperial fragmentation were brutal. The central Roman state, which had once commanded resources from Britain to Mesopotamia, now controlled perhaps a third of the empire's former territory. Tax revenues collapsed. The military struggled to pay soldiers in currency that meant anything. And speaking of currency, numismatic evidence tells a story of economic apocalypse. The denarius, once the bedrock of Mediterranean commerce, had been debased to contain less than 5% silver, essentially worthless bronze with a silver wash. Long-distance trade networks, the arteries of Roman prosperity, seized up. Cities that had thrived for centuries found themselves isolated, their markets empty. But economic collapse and political fragmentation were merely the visible wounds. The invisible killer was far worse. Contemporary Christian writers like Saint Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, documented the horror in his treatise ___, quote, _0___. The plague that bears his name, the plague of Cyprian, had been ravaging the empire since roughly 249 AD. His descriptions chill the blood, even 1,500 years later. Fever, continuous vomiting, deafness and blindness, diarrhea so severe it killed within days, swollen throats, eyes filling with blood, paralysis creeping up from the legs and feet. At its height, ancient sources claim 5,000 people died per day in Rome alone. Archaeological evidence from Thebes in Egypt corroborates the catastrophe. Italian archaeologists discovered mass cremation sites, bodies burned with lime as disinfectant. The kilns still containing charred remains and the pottery that dates the burials to the mid-3rd century. The plague killed 2 emperors. Hostilian fell in 251. Claudius Gothicus would follow in 270. Between them stretched 2 decades of demographic catastrophe. Modern historians estimate mortality rates between 10 and 30% in affected regions. Some cities, like Alexandria, may have lost more than half their population. You need to understand what this meant for the Roman military machine. Legions couldn't recruit. Units that should have numbered 5,000 men operated at half strength or less. The border defenses that had held back barbarian pressure for centuries began to crack. And through those cracks poured tribes who saw weakness and opportunity. For 20 years, Germanic peoples, Goths, Alemanni, Franks, had been testing Roman frontiers. They found them porous. Cities fell. Provinces were ravaged. Roman armies, undermanned and often unpaid, broke and fled. The empire that had conquered from Scotland to the Sahara seemed to have forgotten how to fight. But the plague and political chaos were about to face something worse. An invasion so massive that ancient chroniclers claimed it brought 320,000 warriors and 2,000 ships. The numbers were almost certainly exaggerated. The terror was not. The man who saved the Roman army was murdered by his own generals. Publius Licinius Egnatius Gallienus reigned for 15 years through hell itself, and the Senate hated him for it. Gallienus became co-emperor with his father Valerian in 253 AD. When the Persians captured Valerian in 260, a humiliation that sent shockwaves through the Roman world, Gallienus ruled alone. What he ruled was chaos. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine. Goths ravaged the Balkans and Greece. The Palmyrene kingdom broke away in the east. Postumus established his separatist empire in the west. Usurpers rose and fell with seasonal regularity. The plague killed thousands daily, and the economy had collapsed into barter and requisition. Most emperors would have presided over terminal decline. Gallienus did something revolutionary. He rebuilt the Roman military from the ground up. The traditional Roman system relied on static frontier defenses. The limitani, garrison troops tied to specific provinces. When fast-moving barbarian raiders struck, static legions couldn't respond quickly enough. By the time Roman forces mobilized, the raiders had already plundered and vanished back across the frontier. Gallienus created something new. He detached cavalry units from their parent legions and concentrated them into a mobile reserve, the comitatenses. These weren't garrison troops defending fixed positions. They were a strategic strike force that could rapid deploy to any hotspot. The core of this force became the Equites Dalmatii, Dalmatian cavalry. Modern military historians H.G. Simon and M.P. Speidel have documented how Gallienus recruited these units from the Western Balkans, regions that would provide the empire's best soldiers for the next century. Light to medium cavalry, specialized in harassment, scouting, and the kind of running warfare that could shadow barbarian raiders for days. The Notitia Dignitatum, a 5th century military register, lists 48 units of Equites Dalmatii by the early 400s. That's how successful this innovation became. Gallienus didn't just create a few experimental squadrons. He birthed an entirely new branch of the Roman military. But cavalry reform was only half the revolution. Gallienus did something even more radical. He barred senators from commanding legions. For centuries, Roman military command had been the exclusive privilege of the senatorial aristocracy. Birth, not competence, determined who led armies. Gallienus ended that. He replaced senators with professional equestrian officers, men who had risen through the ranks, who knew war from the shield wall and the saddle, not from philosophical treatises and political connections. Many came from Illyrian and Moesian backgrounds, frontier provinces, places where military competence meant survival. The Senate never forgave him. Later sources, particularly the Historia Augusta written by senatorial sympathizers, painted Gallienus as incompetent, dissolute, a failure. Modern scholarship recognizes this as character assassination. Gallienus created the military system that would save the empire. His reformed cavalry would win Rome's greatest victory in decades. He just wouldn't live to see it. The new cavalry units carried distinctive equipment. The spatha, a longer cavalry sword designed for slashing from horseback. The lancea, or contus, light spears or heavy shock lances depending on the tactical situation. Mail armor for protection while maintaining mobility. They trained in the cuneus formation, the wedge, designed to penetrate and shatter enemy lines. And they mastered one of the most dangerous maneuvers in ancient warfare. The feigned retreat, pretending to flee, drawing the enemy into pursuit, then wheeling and counterattacking required supreme discipline. Done wrong, a feigned retreat became a real rout. Done right, it turned the enemy's aggression into their destruction. The Dalmatian cavalry would prove they could do it right. In the summer of 268, Gallienus's reforms faced their ultimate test. But he would never know the outcome. His own officers, men who commanded the very cavalry he'd created, conspired against him. As he besieged the rebel Aureolus outside Milan, someone in his inner circle, possibly a general named Claudius, possibly a cavalry commander named Aurelian, ordered his assassination. They stabbed him to death outside the walls of Mediolanum. The man who rebuilt Rome's military died by military treachery. Among the conspirators stood the two men who would use his reformed army to save the empire he'd given his life trying to preserve. When Gallienus's blood still stained the ground outside Milan, the army faced a choice. Two generals, both conspirators, both capable. They chose Marcus Aurelius Claudius, not because he was merciful, because he understood politics as well as warfare. Claudius was 54 years old, born on the 10th of May, 214, somewhere in the Balkans. Sources disagree whether Dardania or Sirmium, but agree on his Illyrian origin. He represented the first of what historians call the Illyrian emperors. For the next century, with one exception, every Roman emperor would come from Pannonia, Moesia, or Illyricum. The frontier provinces that had been saving Rome with their blood were about to rule it. Claudius had risen through the professional officer corps Gallienus created. Military tribune under Decius, commander of cavalry under Gallienus, present at the siege of Milan when the assassination went down. Historians debate exactly how involved he was in the conspiracy. The sources that exculpate him were written by people who needed to legitimize his reign. the probability is high that he at least knew and chose not to warn Gallienus. But the army chose him over his rival Aurelian for good reason. Both were brilliant tacticians. Both were Illyrian professionals. But Aurelian had a reputation as a strict disciplinarian, the kind of commander soldiers respected but feared. Claudius possessed what the moment required: political finesse. His first actions demonstrated this genius. The Senate, delighted that the emperor who'd excluded them from military command was dead, began purging Gallienus' supporters. They killed his brother. They killed his surviving son. Political revenge cascading toward civil war. Claudius intervened. He halted the purges. He asked the Senate to show restraint, to deify the murdered emperor rather than desecrate his memory. This wasn't mercy, it was calculation. The legions had loved Gallienus, whatever the Senate thought. Those same legions were watching to see if their service under the previous emperor would be punished. Claudius gave them reassurance. He cemented his legitimacy by honoring his predecessor. The Mediolanum garrison, furious about Gallienus' death, began mutinying. Claudius didn't execute the ringleaders. He paid them 20 auri per soldier, a massive bonus by the standards of the debased currency economy. The mutiny dissolved. The treasury hemorrhaged. But Claudius secured power without fighting a civil war. He couldn't immediately turn to the Goths. The Alemanni, a Germanic confederation, had used the chaos of Gallienus' assassination to invade northern Italy. They'd crossed through the Brenner Pass and were threatening to descend into the Po Valley. If they reached the rich cities of northern Italy, the economic damage would be catastrophic. Claudius marched north and met them at Lake Benacus in 268. The battle was decisive. Roman cavalry, Gallienus' Dalmatian squadrons, shattered the Alemanni formation. The survivors fled back across the Alps. Northern Italy was secure. Only then did Claudius turn his attention to the Balkans, where tens of thousands of Goths were plundering their way north, burdened with loot, slowed by families, heading for the Danube and home. He moved his headquarters to Sirmium, the great strategic crossroads where 5 Roman roads met. From that position, he could strike in any direction. The Goths, retreating through the Balkans with their massive wagon train, were about to discover that the emperor waiting for them wasn't another helpless provincial governor. He was a professional soldier with a professional army, and he'd been studying Gothic tactics for years. The Goths had terrorized Roman provinces for 2 decades. They'd sacked Athens, Sparta, Corinth. They'd defeated Emperor Decius at Abratus, killed him and his son on the battlefield. They had every reason to expect another victory. They were catastrophically wrong. Ancient chroniclers called them Scythians, an old name for a new nightmare. The coalition that assembled at the mouth of the Dniester River in 267 brought together Goths, Heruli, Gepids, and Pusini. The Historia Augusta claimed they came with 6,000 ships, carrying 320,000 warriors. Modern historians recognize this as propaganda inflation. The terror they inflicted was documented fact. You need to understand how ancient sources work. They routinely exaggerate barbarian numbers, often by a factor of 10. The historian Zosimus, writing in the late 5th century, claimed 600,000 Alemanni died at the Battle of Strasbourg in 357. The contemporary historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was actually there, recorded 6,000. See the pattern? Scholarly analysis suggests the Gothic coalition numbered perhaps 30,000 warriors, still a massive force for the era. but not the hundreds of thousands ancient propaganda required to make Roman victories seem miraculous. What made this invasion different wasn't just numbers. These weren't raiders planning a quick strike. They brought their entire societies, families, non-combatants, and thousands of heavy wagons. The cargo, what Romans would later call the lager. These weren't baggage trains. They were mobile fortresses. When drawn into a circle with wheels interlocked, they created a defensive position that had never been successfully stormed in Gothic warfare. The invasion came in two waves. First, in 267, a Heruli-led naval expedition. The Heruli had maritime experience from Black Sea raiding. They provided the ships and seamanship. The coalition loaded onto an estimated 500 to 2,000 vessels. Sources vary wildly, and sailed from the Dniester into the Black Sea. They attacked Thomas and Marcianopolis, but failed to take either city. Roman coastal defenses, weakened though they were, held. The Gothic fleet sailed through the Bosporus into the Propontis. Here, Roman naval forces and the treacherous currents of the straits took their toll. Ships wrecked, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Goths drowned, their inexperience with Mediterranean navigation proving fatal. But enough survived to reach the Aegean. And there, they descended on Greece like a plague. Athens fell, the birthplace of democracy, sacked by Germanic warriors. The Athenian historian Dexippus organized a citizen militia, one of the few documented instances of successful urban resistance. His militia harassed the Gothic raiders, bought time, preserved some lives. But the city still burned. Corinth, Argos, Sparta, names that resonated with centuries of Greek glory, all plundered. The Goths ranged as far as Crete, Rhodes, and Cyprus. Contemporary sources paint a picture of systematic devastation. Then came Emperor Gallienus with his reformed Dalmatian cavalry. He intercepted the Gothic rearguard near the Nestos River on the border between Macedonia and Thrace. The battle was sharp and decisive. Ancient sources document 3,000 Gothic casualties. The survivors retreated north. Gallienus had proven his reforms could work, but he couldn't finish the job. News reached him of Aureolus's rebellion in Italy. He had to choose between pursuing Goths or securing his throne. He chose his throne, left a general named Marcianus to hold the Balkans, and rushed west to his death. The second wave came in 268, larger, more organized. Moving by land, this force crossed the Danube and advanced into Moesia. They laid siege to Thessalonica and Cassandreia, but failed to take either. When word reached them that a Roman emperor, now Claudius, was advancing with a field army, they broke off the sieges. They weren't fleeing in panic. They were executing a calculated withdrawal. They'd accumulated 2 years' worth of plunder. They had families to protect. Their goal was to return across the Danube with their wealth intact. The Morava Valley provided the route. And blocking that route near a city called Naissus stood 50,000 Romans who'd been training for exactly this fight. The Gothic commanders knew Roman tactics. They'd defeated Roman armies for 2 decades. They established their wagon fortress, thousands of heavy wagons arranged in a defensive circle. Historians who study ancient Germanic warfare describe the system precisely. The wagons, drawn tight, created a barrier roughly 1.5 to 2 meters high. Wheels were interlocked or chained together for stability. Shields and timber reinforced the gaps. The defense operated in layers. Heavy infantry stationed between and atop the wagons formed the outer perimeter. Archers and slingers on the wagon roofs provided elevated firing positions. Ancient sources confirm this tactic. Interior reserves of cavalry and elite warriors waited to sally through gaps in the ring. It was brilliant defensive engineering, mobile yet secure. The Romans would learn at terrible cost that storming a Gothic wagon fortress head-on was suicide. The Goths had every advantage. They were retreating into terrain they'd spent months traversing and knew well. They had the wagons for defense. They outnumbered the Romans. Even conservative estimates suggest numerical superiority. And they had 20 years of victories breeding confidence. What they didn't have was speed. Tens of thousands of people, thousands of wagons, herds of livestock, and carts groaning with plunder don't move fast. The Roman cavalry, light and mobile, could cover twice the distance in half the time. And what the Goths didn't know was that the emperor waiting for them had been born in these mountains, had trained in these valleys, commanded men who called this region home. Claudius wasn't defending foreign territory. He was defending his homeland. And he had no intention of letting the Goths leave alive. Naissus sits where 5 major Roman roads intersect, the strategic heart of the Balkans. Modern Niš in Serbia still occupies this crucial position. The Nishava River basin provided exactly what Claudius needed: terrain that turned Gothic strengths into fatal weaknesses. The river valley opened into a wide, flat basin, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. Hills rose on both flanks, providing concealment positions where entire cavalry squadrons could wait unseen. The road network that made Naissus a commercial hub also enabled rapid Roman logistics. Supplies, reinforcements, even message runners could move at speed along paved highways. The Goths, with their wagon train, were confined to unpaved routes that turned to mud with any rain. Geographic analysis of the Nishava basin reveals why Claudius chose this ground. The hills weren't just scenic backdrop. They masked cavalry movement. A Roman commander positioned on high ground could see Gothic formations in the valley below, while his own reserves remained hidden behind the ridgelines. The river itself created choke points. Crossings were limited, controllable. The Goths had to cross somewhere to reach the Danube. Claudius could force them to cross where he wanted, when he wanted, on terrain that favored Roman tactics over Gothic numbers. And critically, this was home terrain for the Illyrian troops in Claudius's army. The Equites Dalmatii came from Dalmatia, just west of here. Many of Claudius's infantry vexellations were recruited from Moesian and Pannonian provinces. These men knew the Balkans intimately. The trees, the trails, the weather patterns, the way sound carried in the valleys. When you're executing a feigned retreat, the most dangerous maneuver in ancient warfare, familiarity with terrain isn't an advantage. It's survival. Claudius's strategic concept was the opposite of static defense. Roman doctrine had traditionally focused on holding fortified positions, making the enemy come to you. Claudius adopted Gallienus's innovation: mobile warfare. Use cavalry to shadow the enemy, harass their foragers, attack their scouts, prevent them from gathering intelligence or supplies. Force them to march where you want them to march. Then, when they're tired, anxious, uncertain, fight them on ground you've chosen. Multiple ancient sources describe Claudius employing exactly this approach. He didn't meet the Goths at the frontier. He let them penetrate into the Balkans, let them burden themselves with plunder and captives, let them grow confident. Then, when they thought they'd successfully retreated through Roman territory, he struck at Naissus, where the terrain nullified their numbers. The Goths needed to cross the Nishava basin to reach the Danube. The valley funneled them toward the Roman positions. The hills concealed Roman strength. The wagon train, their mobile fortress and strategic reserve, became an anchor that prevented rapid maneuver. Claudius understood what the Gothic commanders didn't, that in the Balkans, the army that moved fastest didn't always win. Sometimes, the army that thought fastest won. And he was about to teach 30,000 Gothic warriors everything they'd never learned about Roman tactical evolution. The first Gothic scouts entered the valley on a cold morning in late 268. They saw a Roman army arrayed across the basin floor, exposed. No obvious fortifications, no visible reserves, just men in armor, waiting. It looked like desperation. It was theater. And the curtain was about to rise on Rome's greatest tactical triumph in half a century. At 54 years old, Lucius Domitius Aurelianus commanded all of Claudius's cavalry. Born around September 9th, 214, in Moesia Superior. He'd spent 33 years in the Roman army. The same career arc as his emperor. Enlisted at 21, risen through competence, not connections. Reached high command under Gallienus, helped assassinate him, now stood second in command to Claudius. Where Claudius excelled at politics, Aurelian excelled at violence. His reputation as a strict disciplinarian was well earned. Soldiers who served under him called him, quote, one, because punishment was swift and brutal. That's why the army chose Claudius for emperor. They needed political skill to secure the transition. But they kept Aurelian exactly where his talents served best, leading cavalry. Aurelian's mastery of mobile warfare came from years perfecting Gallienus's reforms. He understood how light cavalry could exhaust heavy infantry through harassment, how to coordinate multiple squadrons across broken terrain, how to time a charge to the minute, striking when the enemy was most vulnerable. Contemporary sources confirm he held the title of commander of all Roman cavalry during Claudius's reign. This wasn't ceremonial. It meant tactical control of Rome's most powerful strike force. At Naissus, Aurelian would personally lead the decisive attack. Ancient sources are explicit on this point. When the moment came, when the Goths had abandoned their defensive positions and scattered themselves in pursuit of _2_ Romans, Aurelian's cavalry would charge from the flanks with precision that military historians still study, but Naissus was practice for what came after. When Claudius died of plague in 270, Aurelian became emperor. His brother Quintillus tried to seize power. The Senate recognized him. But the Danubian legions, the men who'd fought at Naissus, chose Aurelian. Quintillus committed suicide. Rome had its new master. And over the next 5 years, Aurelian earned a title that appears on his coinage, verified by numismatic evidence. Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. In 270 and 271, he continued the Gothic campaigns, defeating a force under King Canabaudes. Ancient sources claim 5,000 Gothic casualties. He drove the survivors from the Balkans into Dacia, improved Black Sea defenses, and then made a strategic decision that would have been unthinkable decades earlier. He abandoned the province of Dacia entirely. The territory north of the Danube, first conquered by Trajan, became the first permanent territorial loss in Roman history. But Aurelian understood what senatorial traditionalists didn't. Dacia was indefensible with available forces. Abandoning it shortened the frontier, concentrated troops where they could actually be supplied, and freed resources for what mattered more, reunifying the empire. In 272 and 273, he marched east and conquered the Palmyrene Empire. Queen Zenobia, who'd broken with Rome and seized Egypt and Syria, was defeated, captured, and paraded in Aurelian's triumph. Egypt's grain shipments resumed. the eastern provinces returned to Roman control. In 274, he turned west and crushed the Gallic Empire. The usurpers who'd held Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania for 14 years fell before his cavalry. By late 274, the impossible had been achieved. The Roman Empire, fractured into 3 pieces in 260, was whole again. None of it would have been possible without Naissus. Aurelian couldn't reunify an empire while fighting Goths at his back. The victory in 268 secured the Balkans, protected Italy, and bought the time needed for the campaigns that followed. But Aurelian's story ended as violently as it began. In November 275, his own officers, suspecting they were marked for execution based on a forged document, assassinated him. Ironic parallel to Gallienus. The emperor who'd helped murder Gallienus died the same way. History, as it often does, repeated itself in blood. At Naissus, though, Aurelian was at his professional peak. 54 years old, veteran of 3 decades of campaigning, commanding the finest cavalry force the Roman Empire had fielded in generations, the Goths were about to discover what professional Roman cavalry could do when led by a man who'd mastered the art of mobile warfare. The question wasn't whether Aurelian's cavalry would charge. The question was when, and whether the Gothic army would survive the answer. The Gothic advance guard entered the Nishava Valley at dawn. Contemporary accounts suggest several hundred horsemen probing ahead of the main column, following standard barbarian scouting doctrine. By midday, ancient sources indicate most had been killed or scattered by Roman light cavalry. The commands and colors historical reconstruction, synthesizing ancient accounts, confirms the Roman equites, Dalmatai, executed their first mission perfectly. Light cavalry, the harassment specialists Gallienus created, struck the Gothic vanguard and then withdrew to the flanks before the main Gothic force could respond. This wasn't about annihilation, it was about psychological warfare. The death of the advance guard meant the Goths were blind. No scouts to probe Roman positions, no intelligence on where the enemy concentrated forces. The main Gothic column advanced more slowly now, more carefully, maintaining tighter formations. This is exactly what the Romans wanted. Slow, predictable. Channeled movement into prepared killing ground. Ancient tactical doctrine from earlier Germanic conflicts describes how Goths would respond to such harassment. Caution, defensive formations, and most critically, focus on the last place they'd seen Romans, which meant they weren't watching the hills where Aurelian's main cavalry force waited in concealment. The Goths weren't amateurs at warfare. They'd been defeating Romans for 20 years. But they'd been defeating garrison troops, undermanned provincial levies, armies caught by surprise or outmaneuvered by Gothic mobility. They'd never faced a fully operational field army commanded by professionals who'd studied Gothic tactics specifically to counter them. As the Gothic main force moved deeper into the valley, Roman cavalry appeared and disappeared like smoke. A squadron would attack a flank, kill a dozen men, then vanish into the hills before Gothic warriors could engage. Foragers sent to gather supplies didn't return. Scouts sent to investigate terrain features were found dead, arranged in ways designed to unnerve. This was terror warfare, and the Goths, who'd pioneered it against Romans, now experienced it themselves. The pattern created exactly the psychological effect Roman doctrine intended. The Gothic commanders faced an impossible decision. Retreat meant abandoning loot, families, the entire campaign. It meant humiliation, but advancing into a valley where Romans appeared and vanished at will, where every shadow might hide cavalry, where their scouts died without warning, that required marching into obvious danger. They were Goths. They'd never retreated from Romans. The main force, perhaps 30,000 strong by conservative modern estimates, advanced into the killing ground near Naissus. And there, arrayed across the valley floor in full battle formation, stood the Roman army, exposed, vulnerable, waiting. The Roman battle line stretched across the Nishava basin, 30 to 50,000 men, according to modern scholarly estimates. Infantry vexellations, detachments from multiple legions, formed the center. Cavalry squadrons held the flanks. No fortifications, no prepared positions, just soldiers in formation on open ground. To the Gothic commanders, it looked like desperation or stupidity. The Romans appeared outnumbered. Ancient sources confirm the Goths held numerical advantage, though exact ratios are lost to history. The Roman center looked isolated, reserves nowhere visible. What the Goths couldn't see were the hills that masked Aurelian's main cavalry force. Topographic analysis of the terrain suggests multiple positions where cavalry could wait in concealment, draws and defiles behind the ridgelines that blocked line of sight from the valley floor. The Goths saw roughly half of Claudius's available forces. They thought they saw everything. Ancient military theory on feigned retreats emphasizes one critical requirement. The enemy must believe they're winning. The Roman center had to look vulnerable enough to attack, weak enough that pursuit seemed worthwhile. But not so weak the Goths suspected a trap. Claudius was gambling everything on discipline. A feigned retreat is the most dangerous maneuver in warfare, precisely because it requires troops to do something that violates every survival instinct. Run away. Turn your back on the enemy. Break formation. Scatter. And trust, absolutely trust, that this is tactical performance, not real rout. One soldier panicking for real could trigger cascade failure. One officer losing his nerve could turn controlled retreat into actual disaster. The Roman infantry knew what was required of them. They drilled this. Officers had explained the plan. But knowing the theory and executing under pressure when thousands of Gothic cavalry are charging you with spears leveled, that's different. That requires trust in command. Trust in your fellow soldiers. Trust that the cavalry watching from the hills will actually charge when promised. The Gothic force configured for standard attack. Cavalry forward to break the enemy line. Infantry behind to exploit the breakthrough. Wagon fortress to the rear as anchor and rallying point. They'd won countless battles with this formation. Every tactical indicator suggested it would work again. The Goths charged at mid-morning, and the valley filled with the thunder of hooves on winter ground. Thousands of Gothic horsemen hit the Roman center like a breaking wave. Ancient descriptions of Germanic cavalry tactics indicate they relied on mass and momentum, concentrated shock to shatter infantry formations through overwhelming force. The impact was tremendous. Contemporary battle accounts from similar engagements describe the chaos, shields splintering under lance thrusts, horses colliding with the shield wall, men screaming as they went down. But the commands and colors scenario, based on ancient sources, confirms what happened next. The Roman infantry held. With help from Aurelian's cavalry leadership, likely squadrons on the immediate flanks preventing Gothic envelopment, the center absorbed the charge without breaking. This wasn't complete success for Rome. The Gothic attack drove the infantry backward. Men died. The line compressed. But compressed is different from shattered. The Roman center gave ground slowly, deliberately, maintaining cohesion. Officers shouted orders. Formations contracted but didn't collapse. To the Goths, this looked like the beginning of victory. Romans retreating under pressure, exactly as they'd seen dozens of times before. Push harder, maintain momentum, break them completely. then slaughter them as they flee. Standard procedure. But the Romans weren't panicking. They were acting. Every step backward was controlled. Casualties mounted, but the formations held together in ways that should have been impossible under such pressure. Then the Roman line began to fragment. Not all at once, gradually. Sections of infantry breaking apart, men turning to run. The cohesion that had held through the initial impact started crumbling. Individual soldiers, then groups, then entire units, fleeing toward the rear. The Gothic cavalry didn't hesitate. They'd seen this too many times to doubt. Romans breaking, running, dying. The Gothic horsemen spurred forward, abandoning their own formation, racing to cut down fleeing infantry before they could escape. Behind them, the Gothic infantry surged forward, eager for the slaughter. Tens of thousands of warriors pouring into the valley basin, leaving their defensive wagon fortress behind, focused entirely on the apparently defeated Romans streaming toward the rear. And from his position on the high ground, Aurelian saw the trap open. The fleeing Romans stopped running, all of them, at once. Multiple ancient sources, including Zosimus and the Historia Augusta, confirm what happened next with remarkable consistency. The Romans executed a feigned retreat, one of the most difficult tactical maneuvers in warfare. At what contemporary chronicles describe as the critical moment, the supposedly fleeing Romans halted, reformed, and counterattacked. The transformation took heartbeats. Scattered men became shield wall. Disordered flight became organized resistance. And from the hills on both flanks, where nothing had been visible moments before, came the thunder of Roman cavalry. Aurelian, in charge of all Roman cavalry during Claudius's reign according to explicit ancient testimony, led the decisive attack. The Dalmatian squadrons he commanded had been waiting in concealment, using terrain that topographic analysis confirms could hide large mounted forces from valley floor observation. The timing was perfect. Goths scattered in pursuit, out of formation, vulnerable. The Roman cavalry charged in the cuneus, the wedge formation designed to penetrate and shatter enemy lines. Contemporary military doctrine described by later Roman military manuals indicates this was standard shock cavalry tactics. But standard doesn't mean easy. Coordinating multiple squadrons to strike simultaneously from both flanks, hitting the enemy at their most vulnerable moment, required discipline and timing that only professional cavalry could execute. The Goths, caught mid-pursuit, faced catastrophe. Reformed Roman infantry blocked their front. Charging cavalry hit their flanks and rear. Ancient sources document that the Romans encircled the Gothic warriors who'd abandoned their wagon fortress to pursue the _3_enemy. Cut off from their defensive positions, scattered across open ground, the Gothic cavalry as an organized fighting force ceased to exist. Contemporary accounts claim 50,000 Goths were killed or captured. Modern historians recognize ancient casualty figures as typically exaggerated, sometimes by factors of 10. But even conservative estimates, accounting for this inflation, suggest casualties in the tens of thousands. The Historia Augusta and other sources agree on one point. This was catastrophic defeat. Multiple ancient sources confirmed the outcome. The Romans destroyed the Gothic cavalry as a fighting force. Thousands of elite warriors who terrorized Roman provinces for 2 decades died in perhaps 30 minutes of combat. Your academic document on the battle cites contemporary testimony that Gothic cavalry, once broken, never reformed as an effective unit during the remainder of the campaign. The encirclement was textbook execution of mobile warfare doctrine. The feigned retreat drew the enemy from their strong position. The hidden cavalry reserve exploited the vulnerability created. The timing coordination between infantry and cavalry demonstrated the professional competence Gallienus's reforms had created. Survivors fled toward the wagon fortress. But as one ancient chronicler noted, wagons guarded by old men, women, and wounded warriors offered little protection against what was coming. The Roman army, fresh from slaughtering the Gothic cavalry, advanced on the Carago with the full fury of professional soldiers who finally had the enemy where they wanted them. In the space of minutes, the tactical situation had reversed completely. The Goths, who'd entered the valley confident and superior in numbers, now huddled behind wooden walls, while a Roman army they'd failed to defeat prepared for siege. The Gothic wagon fortress sat 2 miles north of the main battlefield. Ancient sources describing similar Germanic wagon defenses indicate perhaps 2,000 heavy wagons arranged in a tight circle, wheels interlocked and chained for stability. The barrier rose 1.5 to 2 meters high. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing a century later, used the term Carago to describe exactly this defensive system. The structure operated in layers. Heavy infantry positioned between and atop the wagons formed the outer perimeter. Archers and slingers stationed on wagon roofs created elevated firing platforms, exactly the tactic your research document confirms from ancient Germanic warfare practices. Interior reserves of warriors who'd stayed with the camp, plus families and plunder, filled the center. Roman assaults came hard and fast. But the commands and colors historical reconstruction, based on ancient accounts, confirms a brutal reality. The Romans were repulsed multiple times. Infantry charging wooden walls met arrows from above. Cavalry, useless against static fortifications, could only watch. Each assault cost Roman lives, while the Gothic defenders, protected by elevation and barrier, killed with minimal risk. The wagon fortress, which had seemed like a liability when it prevented Gothic mobility, now proved its value. This was exactly what it was designed for, making infantry assaults suicidal. But Claudius understood siege warfare. Ancient Roman doctrine, refined through centuries of experience, offered an alternative to costly frontal assault. Containment. The Romans established siege lines completely surrounding the wagon fort. No water resupply, no food foraging, no escape routes, just waiting. The psychological pressure on the defenders was immense. They'd watched their cavalry destroyed. They knew the Roman army outside wasn't going anywhere, and they were trapped with limited supplies while winter approached. Time became Rome's weapon. Days passed. The Goths inside the wagon fortress faced impossible mathematics. Tens of thousands of people, combatants and non-combatants, consuming finite supplies. Ancient sources don't specify how long the siege lasted, but the outcome is documented. Eventually, as multiple chronicles confirm, the Goths surrendered. The capitulation was unconditional. Thousands of prisoners filed out of the wagon fortress, warriors, women, children. They'd entered Roman territory as conquerors. They left as captives. But the victory at Naissus, decisive as it was, wasn't complete. Ancient sources document that large numbers of Goths had escaped the battlefield before the encirclement closed. Tens of thousands fled north toward Macedonia, defending themselves with remaining wagons, hoping to reach the Danube and safety. Claudius wasn't about to let them escape. The pursuit began at dawn, and what followed would prove even more devastating than the battle itself. Zosimus, our primary source for this phase, provides explicit detail about what happened next. The surviving Goths, numbering in the tens of thousands, fled north through Macedonia. They defended themselves with their remaining wagons, using the carriages as mobile shields exactly as Zosimus describes in his Historia Nova. But mobility was relative. Families, wounded warriors, remaining livestock, carts loaded with plunder they refused to abandon. All of this slowed the retreat to a crawl. Roman cavalry, unburdened and professional, and covered twice the distance in half the time. The harassment was systematic. Zosimus records that Roman cavalry met the fleeing Goths and killed many of them. This wasn't one battle. It was continuous warfare. Attack the column, kill foragers, prevent resupply, force march with no rest. The Goths couldn't stop to hunt or gather food without being attacked. They couldn't send out parties to find water without those parties being ambushed and slaughtered. Ancient sources document the inevitable result. Many of the Goths and their pack animals, distressed by harassment and want of provisions, perished with hunger. The Goths were forced to slaughter their pack animals for food, eating the very beasts that carried their supplies and wounded. Desperation compounding into disaster. The Romans drove them north toward Mount Haemus, the Balkan mountain range. This wasn't accidental. Claudius methodically channeled the Gothic retreat into terrain that would become a trap. The high passes of Mount Haemus in winter offered no forage, no game, no water that wasn't frozen. And the Roman army, coming behind, could seal the passes and create a siege without walls. Multiple sources confirm what happened when the Goths reached the mountains. The Romans surrounded them. Trapped in the high passes during the winter of 269 to 270, the Goths faced three enemies: the Roman army maintaining the siege, starvation as supplies ran out, and the plague of Cyprian. Contemporary chronicles document that an epidemic affected the entrapped Goths at Mount Haemus. The same disease that had been killing Romans for 20 years found a new population. Tens of thousands of people packed together in mountain passes, weakened by hunger, exposed to winter cold, lacking clean water. Perfect conditions for plague transmission. The Goths died in massive numbers, some from Roman attacks, more from starvation, most, perhaps, from disease. The Historia Augusta records that survivors of the Gothic tribes at Mount Haemus were so stricken with famine and pestilence that Claudius scorned to conquer them further. They were destroying themselves faster than his army could kill them. Ancient sources note a battle at Mount Haemus that was bloody but inconclusive. The Goths managed to escape but were pursued again until final surrender. The plague, ironically, had done what the Roman army alone couldn't: ensured absolute Gothic defeat. But biological weapons cut both directions. Zosimus explicitly states that the plague affected the pursuing Romans as well. Close contact with infected Goths during the siege meant the disease spread to Roman ranks. Soldiers who'd survived the battlefield began dying of fever and hemorrhaging blood. The price of victory was being calculated in a currency Rome hadn't anticipated, and the highest price was yet to be paid. In early 270, the Gothic survivors surrendered. Perhaps 20,000 men, women and children stumbled out of the mountain passes. Contemporary sources describe them as half dead from hunger and disease. They'd entered the empire 2 years earlier as a conquering horde. They left Mount Haemus as broken remnants of shattered tribes. Roman pragmatism dictated their fate. Multiple sources, including Wikipedia's synthesis of ancient accounts, confirm that prisoners were given two options. Able-bodied warriors were drafted into the Roman legions. They would serve in later campaigns of Claudius and Aurelian, fighting for the empire that had destroyed their people. Others were settled as colony, tenant farmers, on land in devastated border provinces. Your research document explains the strategic logic. The plague of Cyprian and constant warfare had left vast tracts in Moesia, Thrace, and Illyricum abandoned. Dead villages, empty fields, no tax revenue. Settling defeated Goths on this land accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It kept the territory productive. It created taxable population. It provided a buffer zone of inhabitants who would, over time, Romanize and provide future military recruits. The defeated became assets. Enemies transformed into soldiers and farmers. It was brutal efficiency, the kind of pragmatic cruelty that kept empires functioning. But the plague didn't care about strategic calculations. Contemporary chronicles uniformly confirm that Emperor Claudius fell ill with the plague of Cyprian in late 269 or early 270. He traveled to Sirmium and was preparing a campaign against the Vandals when disease overtook him. Eutropius records that he was Orosius, states that the chronograph of 354 gives his reign as Jerome and Aurelius Victor. Both record scholars date Claudius's death variously to January, April, August, or September of 270. The conflicting sources making precision impossible. But the cause is undisputed. The plague that had ravaged the empire for 2 decades, that had killed thousands of besieged Goths at Mount Haemus, killed the emperor at Sirmium. The irony was complete. The disease that helped Rome win by destroying the trapped Gothic army turned on the victor. Claudius Gothicus, conqueror of the Goths, savior of the Balkans, died at age 56 from the same epidemic that had facilitated his victory. Contemporary sources note something remarkable. Claudius was the first emperor since Septimius Severus to die naturally, by disease rather than assassination. In an age when emperors were murdered with mechanical regularity, dying of plague counted as a natural death. The observation says everything about 3rd century imperial mortality. The Senate immediately deified him. A golden shield hung in the Senate House, a golden statue erected in the Capitol. Eutropius records that the Senate honored him with extraordinary distinctions. For an emperor who'd reigned less than 2 years, this was unprecedented. But Claudius had done what seemed impossible. He'd won. His brother Quintillus tried to seize power. The Senate recognized him. But the Danubian legions, the men who'd fought at Naissus and pursued Goths to Mount Haemus, chose Aurelian instead. Quintillus committed suicide. The cavalry commander who'd led the decisive charge at Naissus became emperor, inheriting the reunification mission that Claudius' death left unfinished. The plague had killed the emperor who saved Rome, but it couldn't kill what he'd accomplished. The Goths were broken, the frontier secure, and Aurelian had the example, the army, and the will to restore the Roman world. Ancient sources claim 50,000 Goths died at Naissus. The Historia Augusta, Zosimus, and other chronicles repeat variations of this figure. Modern historians apply source criticism to these numbers with warranted skepticism. You need to understand the pattern. Ancient writers routinely inflated barbarian casualties, often by factors of 10 or more. The example bears repeating because it's so clear. Zosimus claimed 600,000 Alemanni perished at Strasbourg in 357. Ammianus Marcellinus, who was actually present at the battle, recorded 6,000, 10 times smaller. This pattern appears across ancient military history with mechanical consistency. If we apply similar skepticism to Naissus, and if the Gothic invasion force totaled roughly 30,000 warriors by conservative modern estimates, then even 30% casualties, 9,000 dead, represents catastrophic defeat for the era. 50% casualties, 15,000, would constitute near annihilation of Gothic military power. Add to battlefield deaths the thousands who died during the pursuit to Macedonia. Add the thousands more who perished in the siege at Mount Haemus from starvation and plague. Add the thousands captured at the Wagon Fortress and after the final surrender. The cumulative losses destroyed a generation of Gothic warriors. What we can verify with certainty matters more than disputed body counts. Multiple sources confirm that the Romans destroyed Gothic cavalry as an organized force. Historical records document that Gothic power in the Balkans was broken for decades after Naissus. No major Gothic invasion occurred until the late 3rd or early 4th century. The Danubian frontier, terrorized for 20 years, gained a generation of relative security. Modern military historians recognize Naissus as one of the crises of the 3rd century's decisive battles. Not because of the exact casualty figures, those are lost to ancient exaggeration and modern uncertainty, but because of documented outcome. The Gothic threat that had seemed unstoppable simply stopped. Comparative context helps understand the scale. For the 3rd century Roman Empire, this was a massive engagement. The assembled forces on both sides represented significant portions of available military power. The casualties, even at conservative modern estimates, exceeded those of most contemporary battles. The Battle of Abrides in 251, where Goths killed Emperor Decius and his son, probably involved smaller forces and fewer total casualties, despite being remembered as a Roman disaster. Lake Benicus in 268, where Claudius defeated the Alemanni, was tactically important, but strategically limited to securing northern Italy. Naissus combined tactical brilliance with strategic decisiveness. The perfect execution of the feigned retreat produced consequences that lasted decades. Ancient chroniclers, whatever their numerical exaggerations, understood they were describing something historically significant. The psychological impact of the Gothic defeat resonated across the empire and beyond its frontiers. Romans who'd known only defeat for 20 years suddenly had proof that their armies could still win. Barbarian peoples who'd seen Goths as invincible warriors now saw them broken and scattered. Numbers matter, but outcomes matter more. And the outcome at Naissus, documented across multiple independent sources, was the shattering of Gothic military power in the Balkans at exactly the moment when Rome needed victory most desperately. With the Goths shattered, Aurelian could do what no emperor had managed in a decade: turn his back on the Danube frontier. Not permanently, but long enough to reconquer the world. Multiple sources confirm that Naissus largely removed the threat from Germanic tribes in the Balkan frontier for the following decades. This wasn't just tactical breathing room. This was strategic transformation. An empire that had been fighting defensive actions on every frontier simultaneously could suddenly concentrate forces for offensive operations. When Claudius died in early 270, the succession crisis was brief. His brother Quintillus seized power, and the Senate recognized him. But the Danubian legions, the men who'd fought at Naissus, who'd pursued Goths to Mount Haemus, who'd watched their comrades die of plague, chose Aurelian, within weeks or perhaps months. Depending on which ancient source you trust, Quintillus was dead. Suicide, murder, or battle death. The sources disagree, but the result was certain. Aurelian became emperor. He immediately faced Gothic incursions that Claudius's death had encouraged. In 271, Aurelian repelled another Gothic invasion. Ancient sources document a battle against a force led by a king named Canabaudes, possibly Cneva, the victor of Abrides, or a successor. The Romans claimed 5,000 Gothic casualties. Aurelian drove survivors from the Balkans into Dacia, improved Black Sea defenses, and then made a decision that would have been heresy decades earlier. He abandoned Dacia The province north of the Danube, first conquered by Trajan in the 1st century, became the first permanent territorial loss in Roman history. Archaeological and literary sources confirm this watershed moment. Rome would never reconquer Dacia. But Aurelian understood strategic reality. Dacia extended the frontier into indefensible territory. Withdrawing from it shortened the defensive perimeter, concentrated forces where they could be supplied and reinforced, and freed resources for what mattered more: reunification. In 270 and 271, Aurelian secured Italy and defeated Vandals, Juthungi, and Sarmatians, who'd invaded during the transition chaos. Then he turned east. The Palmyrene campaign of 272 to 273 saw Aurelian march into Syria and confront Queen Zenobia's forces. Contemporary sources document multiple battles at Imae and Emesa. The Palmyrene heavy cavalry and cataphract forces that had dominated Eastern warfare met Roman mobile tactics and lost. Zenobia was captured. Egypt's grain shipments, cut off since Palmyra's seizure of the province, resumed flowing to Rome and Italy. In 274, Aurelian turned west and crushed the Gallic Empire. The usurpers who'd held Gaul, Britannia, and portions of Hispania surrendered. By late 274, the Roman Empire was reunited into a single entity. Wikipedia and multiple scholarly sources confirm this extraordinary achievement. The fracture of 260 had been healed in less than 15 years, and Naissus was the beginning. Historians universally recognize the causal chain. Without Naissus securing the Balkans, Aurelian couldn't have marched east or west. He would have been fighting Goths at his back, while Zenobia and the Gallic emperors consolidated their breakaway states. The reunification campaigns of 270 to 274 required the strategic security that Claudius's victory in 268 provided. Aurelian earned his title, Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Numismatic evidence confirms this appeared on his coinage. But he knew what the Senate preferred to forget. The empire he'd restored was fundamentally changed, which is why he built walls around Rome itself. The Aurelian walls, begun in 271, still stand in modern Rome. 12 meters high, 19 kilometers in circumference, encircling the Eternal City. They're monuments to achievement and admission of reality simultaneously. Rome could be reunified. But the frontiers could no longer be trusted to keep the capital safe. The city itself needed fortifications for the first time in centuries. The walls still stand, a permanent reminder that Naissus saved Rome, but couldn't restore what had been lost. The world Aurelian restored was harder, more militarized, less confident than the empire that existed before the crisis began. Claudius Gothicus started something that lasted 100 years, from 268 to 378, with one exception. Every Roman emperor came from the same region: Pannonia, Moesia, Illyricum. The provinces that had saved Rome now ruled it. Prosopographical studies, analysis of imperial origins, show a clear pattern. Claudius, born in the Balkans. Aurelian from Moesia Superior. Probus, who succeeded Aurelian, from Sirmium in Pannonia. Diocletian, the emperor who finally ended the crisis and reformed the empire into the Tetrarchy, came from Dalmatia. Constantine, who would make Christianity the imperial religion, was born in Naissus itself, the very city where Claudius won his greatest victory. The only exception to this Illyrian dominance came in 378, when Theodosius I, from Hispania, became emperor. Otherwise, for a century after Naissus, the Balkans produced every legitimate emperor. Why? The answer lies in what Gallienus created and Claudius proved: the mobile cavalry force, the professional officer corps, the merit-based promotion system, all came from the Balkans. The equites Dalmatii originated in Dalmatia. The reformed legions drew heavily from Moesian and Pannonian recruitment. When competence rather than senatorial pedigree determined military advancement, Illyrian professionals rose to the top. And they stayed there. Successful emperors promoted fellow Illyrians who'd proven themselves in the same campaigns. The officer corps that fought at Naissus promoted subordinates who'd learned mobile warfare in the Balkans. Those subordinates eventually became generals. Those generals became emperors. The pattern self-perpetuated. Gallienus's reforms, which the Senate had despised, became the foundation of late Roman military structure. The mobile cavalry he pioneered evolved into the comitatenses, the field armies of the 4th century. Constantine formalized the system, creating permanent mobile forces under generals titled Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers. The distinction between frontier garrison troops and mobile field forces that Gallienus improvised became official imperial policy. The professional officer corps that he created over senatorial opposition became standard practice. The tactical innovations tested at Naissus, feigned retreats, coordinated cavalry charges, harassment warfare, entered Roman military doctrine. Military historians trace the evolution of the late Roman army directly to these 3rd century reforms. The army that defeated the Goths at Naissus was fundamentally different from the legionary army of the Principate. More cavalry-centric, more mobile, more professional, less dependent on static frontier defense. These changes presaged medieval warfare patterns, the eventual dominance of heavy cavalry over infantry formations. Modern military academies still study Naissus. The feigned retreat executed there remains a textbook example of high-risk tactics requiring absolute discipline. Staff colleges use it to teach principles of deception, timing, and combined arms coordination. The tactical manual case study from Commands and Colors demonstrates continuing relevance in military education. The broader institutional impact matters as much as tactical innovation. Naissus vindicated Gallienus's bet on merit over birth. The Senate that had excluded him from command spent the next century ruled by the professional officers he promoted, the barbarians from frontier provinces, the Illyrians and Moesians that Roman aristocrats looked down upon, saved the empire that senatorial incompetence had nearly destroyed. The irony runs deeper. Gallienus was assassinated by his own officers, vilified by senatorial historians, and remembered in sources like the Historia Augusta as a failure. But his military system ruled for a century. His reforms saved the empire. His professional officer corps produced Claudius, Aurelian, Probus, Diocletian, and Constantine. The crisis of the 3rd century didn't end immediately after Naissus. It would rage another 14 years until Diocletian's accession in 284. But Naissus was the turning point. The moment Rome proved it could still adapt, still fight, still win when led by competent professionals rather than aristocratic amateurs. The Battle of Abritus in 251 killed an emperor. The Battle of Edessa in 260 saw another emperor captured by Persians. Both were catastrophes that shook the empire to its core. But we remember Naissus differently, because Naissus was the moment Rome stopped losing. What was actually at stake transcended tactical considerations. This wasn't just another frontier battle. Naissus tested whether the reformed Roman military could function against a major threat, whether Gallienus's innovations would work under pressure, whether professional competence could defeat numerical superiority. whether the empire that had been fragmenting for decades possessed the institutional capability to survive. The psychological impact mattered as much as the strategic outcome. Romans had known only defeat for 20 years. Germanic invasions had become routine. Provincial populations expected Roman armies to lose. When Claudius won at Naissus, decisively, dramatically, with tactics that ancient sources on both sides documented as brilliant, it shattered the narrative of inevitable decline. Compare Naissus to other crisis battles. Abritus saw Romans lose and Emperor Decius die on the field. Edessa witnessed Emperor Valerian's capture, the greatest humiliation in Roman military history. The Battle of Naissus in 267 was a Roman victory, but limited in scope. Gallienus defeated a Gothic rearguard, not a main force. Lake Benicus in 268 defeated the Alemanni, but only secured northern Italy. Naissus combined tactical brilliance with strategic decisiveness. The feigned retreat, successfully executed against a massive force, demonstrated that Roman armies could still perform complex maneuvers requiring supreme discipline. The cavalry charge that broke Gothic power showed that Gallienus's reforms produced real combat capability. The systematic pursuit to Mount Haemus proved Roman commanders understood how to convert battlefield victory into strategic triumph. And the consequences lasted decades. Gothic power in the Balkans, dominant for 20 years, vanished. The frontier that had been constantly threatened gained a generation of security. Aurelian, freed from fighting Goths, could reunify the empire. The Illyrian officer corps that led at Naissus would rule Rome for a century. Counterfactual analysis, always speculative but instructive, suggests the stakes were existential. If Goths won at Naissus, the Balkans fall. Italy lies exposed. Aurelian can't fight in 3 directions simultaneously. The Gallic Empire consolidates in the west. Palmyra dominates the east. Central Roman authority collapses permanently. Western Rome might fall in the 3rd century instead of the 5th. The historical trajectory of Europe changes fundamentally. This isn't wild speculation. Historians recognize that Naissus created the strategic conditions for everything that followed. The reunification of 270 to 274 required the security that 268 provided. The tetrarchy that Diocletian established in 293 built on military reforms that Naissus vindicated. The Constantine dynasty traced its origins to Naissus itself. Constantine was born there. Why has Naissus been partially forgotten when Adrianople in 378, a Roman disaster, is more famous? The answer lies in sources and politics. Dexippus's contemporary account was lost. Zosimus, writing centuries later, had political and religious biases that shaped his narrative. The Historia Augusta, fabricated and unreliable, confused rather than clarified. Later historians focused on Constantine's reign and needed to glorify his dynasty, which meant emphasizing Constantine's birthplace, but not necessarily the battle that secured it. The regional factor matters. Naissus took place in the Balkans, away from Rome and Italy. Ancient historiography centered on the capital. Battles in distant provinces received less detailed coverage unless they directly threatened the city of Rome. Naissus saved Rome indirectly by securing the frontier, less dramatic in contemporary accounts than battles where barbarians reached Italy itself. But military historians recognize what ancient sources sometimes obscured. Naissus demonstrated principles that remain relevant. Mobility defeating mass. Discipline, enabling deception. Professional training, overcoming numerical disadvantage. Strategic patience, allowing tactical boldness. These lessons transcend ancient warfare. Modern strategic studies still reference Naissus when teaching asymmetric warfare, institutional reform during crisis, and the psychological dimensions of military victory. The battle appears in military academy curricula as a case study in combined arms operations and high-risk tactics. The transformation matters more than the battle. Rome that stumbled into Naissus, fractured, diseased, economically collapsed, wasn't the Rome that emerged. Gallienus despised reforms, became orthodox. Professional officers replaced aristocratic amateurs permanently. The Illyrian provinces dominated imperial succession for a century. The mobile field army became standard force structure. These changes didn't solve all problems. The empire still faced invasions, civil wars, economic instability. But Naissus proved Rome could still change, still adapt, still prevail when competence replaced corruption. That proof, documented in victory, sustained the empire through its darkest years and enabled the recovery that followed. In the winter of 268 or 269, sources disagree even on the date. A Roman army of perhaps 50,000 men defeated a Gothic coalition that ancient chroniclers numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Modern historians doubt those numbers, but they don't doubt the outcome. The feigned retreat, a maneuver so dangerous that ancient military manuals warned against it, executed perfectly by troops reformed only years earlier. Aurelian's cavalry charge, timed to the minute, launched from concealment at exactly the moment of Gothic vulnerability. The pursuit to Mount Haemus, relentless and systematic, that converted battlefield victory into strategic triumph. The plague that killed the besieged and then killed the emperor who besieged them. These aren't legends. These are documented historical facts. Tens of thousands died. The exact number, lost to ancient exaggeration and time, matters less than the reality. An entire generation of Gothic warriors destroyed in weeks. But Romans paid too. Claudius Gothicus, savior of the empire, dead from the same plague that helped him win. The Illyrian soldiers who executed the perfect feigned retreat, how many survived the disease that followed? The chronicles don't say. Victory's full cost is rarely calculated. The empire that emerged from Naissus was fundamentally different from the one that stumbled into it. Gallienus's despised reforms, mobile cavalry, professional officers, Illyrian meritocracy, became the new normal. For the next century, men from Pannonia and Moesia ruled the Roman world. The Senate's aristocratic monopoly on military command never returned. The crisis wasn't over. It would rage for another 14 years until Diocletian. But Naissus was the moment Rome proved it could still adapt, still fight, still win. The Goths who surrendered became Romans. Their children served in the legions. Their grandchildren might have fought at Adrianople in 378, when the Goths finally got their revenge and destroyed a Roman army under Emperor Valens. The plague that killed tens of thousands at Mount Haemus killed the emperor at Sirmium. The reforms that saved the empire came from an emperor the Senate despised. The cavalry commander who won the battle had helped murder the emperor who created that cavalry, then became emperor himself. History is rarely tidy. By 274, Aurelian had reunified the empire. The Gallic usurpers defeated. The Palmyrene queen conquered. The Roman world whole again. None of it would have been possible without Naissus. None of it would have been necessary without the crisis that made Naissus inevitable. Naissus didn't end Rome's troubles, but it proved Rome could still end its enemies. And for one winter in 268, on the frozen fields near a city where 5 Roman roads met, Rome remembered how to be Rome, even if being Rome meant embracing the very barbarians it had spent centuries despising. The battlefield near Nis in modern Serbia holds no grand monuments. Time and construction have buried most traces. But the victory achieved there rippled through history in ways the soldiers who fought couldn't have imagined. They saved an empire, temporarily, because history offers no permanent victories. Only reprieves bought with blood, paid for with plague, remembered through fragments of chronicles and the evidence written in earth and bone. 250 years later, Zosimus would write his history, looking back from a Byzantine world that barely resembled the empire Claudius saved. He saw Naissus as one victory among disasters. He was wrong. Naissus was the moment Rome stopped falling and started clawing back. Not because the empire became stronger, because it learned that the world had changed and changed with it. The Goths returned a century later as refugees fleeing the Huns. Rome granted them entry. At Adrianople in 378, those Gothic refugees destroyed the same Roman army that had crushed their ancestors at Naissus. Emperor Valens died on that field. Circle closed. Victory and defeat, separated by a century, connected by blood and memory and the impossible mathematics of imperial survival. Naissus saved the Roman Empire. For a while. But for one decisive campaign in Rome's darkest century, professional soldiers led by competent commanders proved that even a broken empire could still break its enemies. That lesson, bought with 50,000 lives and validated by a century of Illyrian emperors, remains relevant whenever institutions face existential crisis and must choose between tradition and transformation. The plague-ravaged emperor died at Sirmium, but what he won at Naissus lived on. Sometimes that's all history offers. Temporary victories, permanent consequences, and the reminder that when empires remember how to value competence over pedigree, they can still surprise the world with what professional determination can achieve.